The boy who always stayed. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists between two people who have known each other too long to pretend. It is not an awkward silence. It is not an empty one. It is the kind of silence that holds the weight of every conversation you have ever had, every secret shared on a dark night, every laugh that came out so hard it turned into tears. It is comfortable. It is warm. It is home. That is what Daniel Rivera had always been to me, a silence that felt like home. We met when we were 9 years old. His family had moved into the house directly across from ours on Maple Creek Drive, and he had appeared at my front door the very first morning with a soccer ball under his arm, and an expression that managed to be both shy and completely unafraid at the same time. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that his mother was always trying to fix, and brown eyes that, even as a child, seemed to be paying more attention to the world than most people bothered to. "Do you want to play?" he had asked simply. No hello, no introduction, just the question. I said yes. I have been saying yes to Daniel ever since. For 12 years, 12 years of shared lunches and late-night phone calls, of study sessions that turned into movie marathons, of road trips with the windows down, and the volume up. Daniel Rivera was the single most constant presence in my life. He was there when my parents divorced. I was there when his grandfather passed away. He held my hand in the hospital when I broke my wrist falling off a skateboard. I stayed up with him until 4 in the morning, when he failed his driving test for the second time, and was convinced that the universe had a personal vendetta against him. He was my person. That's the only way I knew how to say it. He was simply my person. And for 12 years I had told myself that was exactly what it was: friendship. Deep, rare, irreplaceable friendship. The kind people write songs about, the kind that lasts a lifetime. Nothing more. Nothing that required examination. Nothing that needed a name beyond the one it already had. I was 21 years old before I understood that I had been lying to myself for most of my life. My name is Ethan Cole, and this is the story of the day my best friend told me he loved me, and how I stood there in complete silence, unable to say a single word, and everything that happened after. The year everything shifted. The spring of our junior year at Hargrove University was when things began to change, though I could not have named the change while it was happening. It arrived the way most important things do, quietly, in the margins, disguised as nothing. Daniel and I had always lived on the same floor of the same dormitory. Our rooms were 6 doors apart, close enough that we had a running joke about the fact that we had essentially moved away from home only to reconstruct the same geography we had always known. His side, my side, the invisible street between us. That March, something shifted in the texture of our time together. He started showing up at my door in the evenings with no particular reason, just to sit, just to be there. We would put on some show neither of us was really watching and talk about everything and nothing, and sometimes we would fall into those long, easy silences, and I would look over and find him looking at me, and he would quickly look away. I noticed it. I filed it somewhere internal, some drawer I did not open. He was also, I realized slowly, doing things he had always done but differently. He had always been physically easy with me, the way that boys who have been friends since childhood sometimes are, comfortable with proximity in a way that doesn't require thought. He would throw an arm around my shoulder, steal food from my plate, fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives. That had always been normal. That had always been just us. But that spring, I started noticing the moments when he did not do those things. The moments when he would sit just slightly further away than usual. When he would start to reach for something, my arm, my shoulder, the sleeve of my jacket, and then stop himself. Withdraw. As if he had been reaching for something he had decided he wasn't allowed to touch. I noticed that too. I did not open that drawer either. What I did instead was what I always do when something confusing enters my life. I worked. I buried myself in my coursework, in my part-time job at the campus bookstore, in long runs through the early morning when the world was still quiet and I could think or not think as I chose. I ran away from the thing I hadn't yet admitted was there. Daniel, meanwhile, had become friends that semester with a guy named Marcus Webb, funny, loud, easy to be around, the kind of person who walked into rooms and immediately made them feel more populated. Marcus was openly gay, entirely comfortable in his own skin, and he had a way of talking about identity and love, and the experience of being who you are without apology that I found, privately, both fascinating and destabilizing in a way I couldn't quite explain. I would sit with Daniel and Marcus sometimes in the campus cafe, listening to Marcus talk, and I would watch Daniel's face while he listened. There was something in Daniel's expression during those conversations, something attentive and searching, like a person looking for a word they have forgotten but recognize they know. I did not look at that either. The night everything broke open was a Friday in late April. We had both been in the library for most of the day, finals were approaching, and the comfortable desperation of pre-exam week had settled over the campus like weather. I had texted Daniel at around 9 in the evening suggesting we walk to the Thai place 2 blocks from campus, the one we had been going to since freshman year, the one where the owner knew our order and always brought extra spring rolls without being asked. He had texted back, "Yeah, need air." We walked through the warm April night with our jackets unzipped, the air carrying that particular smell of spring in the city, cut grass and something blooming, and the faint urban undertone that you stop noticing after a while unless you've been inside all day. We talked about exams, about a professor we both found maddening, about a movie Daniel had seen the previous weekend that he thought I would hate and wanted me to watch anyway. Dinner was easy. Dinner was always easy with us. The spring rolls arrived without being requested. We argued mildly about whether the new Thai iced tea was better than the old recipe. I said yes. Daniel was a traditionalist and said absolutely not. We split the bill the way we always did, each paying for our own because we had long ago decided that keeping track was more trouble than it was worth. Walking back, we took the long route without discussing it, through the park that ran along the east edge of campus, where the path was lined with lights that turned everything amber in the dark. It was the route we had always taken when we weren't in a hurry, the route we took when the night was too good to end quickly. It was on that path, under those amber lights, that Daniel stopped walking. I went a step or two further before I realized he had stopped, and then I turned around. He was standing with his hands in his jacket pockets, looking at me. His expression was, I struggled to name it even in that moment. It was the look of someone who has arrived at the edge of something after a very long walk and is standing at the edge, deciding. "Hey," I said, "you okay?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the path. He looked up at the amber lights. He exhaled once, slowly, the way people do when they are trying to steady themselves for something. "I need to tell you something," he said. "And I need you to let me finish before you say anything, okay? Because if you say anything in the middle, I'll lose it." My chest did something then, something I could not name. I said, "Okay." "The confession." He looked at me for a long moment, and then he began. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for about 6 months," he said. His voice was steady but careful, the way a person is careful when they are carrying something fragile. "I've written it down. I've rehearsed it. I've talked myself out of it about 40 times. And I've realized that there's no version of this that I can make perfect, so I'm just going to say it the real way." He paused. The amber lights cast shadows along the path. Somewhere in the park, someone was playing music very faintly, something slow, something that drifted. "I'm in love with you, Ethan." The words landed in the air between us like something physical, like something with weight and texture and temperature. I felt them hit me, and I felt, simultaneously. The most extraordinary thing, I was not surprised. Somewhere underneath everything, underneath all those closed drawers and filed-away moments and deliberate not looking, I had known. I had known for longer than I could admit, and the shock I felt was not the shock of something new. It was the shock of recognition. He kept going. He had said he needed to finish, and he kept his word. I know this is a lot. I know we've been best friends since we were 9 years old, and I know that this is the kind of thing that could make everything weird and complicated, and I have spent a long time being terrified of that, of losing what we have, because what we have is the most important thing in my life. His voice caught slightly on that. He pressed on. You are the most important thing in my life. And that's exactly why I can't keep this inside anymore, because it's gotten to the point where every time I'm with you, I'm carrying it, and I don't want to carry it alone anymore. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I'm not asking you for anything. I just needed you to know the truth, because you deserve the truth, and because I was starting to lose pieces of myself trying to hide it. He stopped. He was breathing carefully. He looked at me, and in his eyes I could see everything, the fear, the relief of having said it, the desperate hope trying to stay small, the love that was so plain and so full that I didn't understand how I could have looked at it for 12 years and called it something else. He said, "Okay, you can talk now." And I opened my mouth. And nothing came out. I stood there in the amber light with my mouth open and my heart doing something violent inside my chest, and I could not produce a single word. Not one. Not a sound. I had never in my life been unable to speak. I was a person who talked, who had always talked, who filled silences easily, who had words for everything, who had never once stood in front of Daniel Rivera and not known what to say. For 12 years, he had been the person I talked to about everything. He was the person I came to when I had no words for anyone else. And now he was looking at me, waiting, having just handed me the most honest and vulnerable thing he had ever offered another human being. And I was standing there in silence like someone had reached into my chest and disconnected something essential. The seconds passed. They passed the way seconds do when you are standing in the middle of the worst moment of your own making, slowly, each one registering individually, each one making the silence heavier. Something moved across Daniel's face, something I will never fully forgive myself for causing. It was the slow, careful closing of a door, the expression of someone who has taken a tremendous risk and is watching in real time as the risk reveals itself to have been a mistake. He wasn't angry. That would have been easier. He was something quieter and much harder to witness. He was becoming resigned. "It's okay," he said softly. He said it like someone who has been practicing saying it for a long time, like someone who had rehearsed not just the confession but also its failure. "You don't have to say anything. I needed to say it, that's all. We're okay." He started walking again, past me, back toward the dorms. I turned and watched him go, and something in me was screaming, and I still could not make it form into words, and I stood there on that amber-lit path alone until he had rounded the bend and disappeared from sight. The night between. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my dorm room with the ceiling above me and the hum of the building around me, and I stared and I thought, and I tried to understand what was happening inside me. Because something was happening. Something enormous and structural, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface of everything I thought I knew about myself. And I could feel it moving, but I could not yet see its shape. I thought about the way I had felt standing on that path. Not just the shock, not just the paralysis. I thought about the moment Daniel had said the words, "I'm in love with you," and what had happened in my body before my mind could intervene. Before the fear arrived, before the overwhelm, in the very first instant before I had time to think anything at all. What I had felt was warmth. I lay there and I let myself sit with that, really sit with it, without immediately explaining it away. Warmth. The specific warmth of something you have wanted for a long time arriving, finally, at your door. And then came the avalanche. Memory after memory, arriving with new context, reframing themselves in the light of what I now knew. The way I had always felt physically aware of Daniel in a way I had never felt with other friends. the specific awareness of where he was in a room, the warmth of his presence beside me, the particular quality of my discomfort in his recent absences. The way certain things he did, certain looks, certain laughs, certain casual moments of closeness, registered in me as something more than friendly warmth. The inexplicable way my mood was connected to his. The way I had always chosen him in every situation without having to think about it. The way I had felt, somewhere I never admitted, when he had briefly dated a girl in sophomore year. The way I had told myself my distance during that period was just stress, was just a difficult semester, was just anything other than what it actually was. I lay there in the dark and I let myself see it clearly, perhaps for the first time. And what I saw was this. I had spent 12 years loving Daniel Rivera and telling myself it was friendship. Not because I didn't know the difference, but because knowing the difference would have required me to know something about myself that I was not ready to know. I thought about the word I had never applied to myself. Never out loud, never privately, never even in the most secret interior corridors of my own mind. I had walked carefully around it for years, around its edges, giving it space, never looking directly at it. And now I lay in my bed at 1 in the morning, 21 years old, and I made myself look at it directly. I was in love with my best friend, who was a man, who had just told me he loved me, and I had stood there in silence like a coward and watched him walk away thinking he had made a terrible mistake. "Oh," I said, alone in the dark. It was the only word I had managed to produce in the last 2 hours, and it contained everything. At 2:30 in the morning, I got up and paced. At 3, I sat at my desk and tried to write down what I was feeling and couldn't. At 3:45, I stood at my window and looked at the campus and tried to imagine going to Daniel's room, walking down the hallway, knocking on his door, saying the things that needed to be said. But it was the middle of the night, and he was probably finally asleep, and I had to be honest with myself. I was afraid. Not afraid of Daniel. Never that. I was afraid of myself, afraid of arriving at his door and opening my mouth and having the same terrible silence swallow me again, afraid of wanting to say something true and finding only static. I had spent 21 years building a certain story about who I was, a certain careful, comfortable story. And tonight that story had revealed a gap at its center, a missing piece that had been there the whole time, and I was only now picking it up and turning it over in my hands. That takes time. It takes longer than one night. But I also knew, sitting in the blue pre-dawn quiet of my room, that Daniel had taken a risk that must have cost him enormously. He had handed me something precious and irreplaceable, and watched me stand there and hold it in silence. Every hour I waited now was another hour in which that silence was the only answer he had received. I picked up my phone, I put it down, I picked it up again. At 4:17 in the morning I typed, "I'm sorry I couldn't speak. There's a lot I need to say to you and I need to say it right. Can we talk tomorrow?" I stared at it for a long time, then I sent it. 3 minutes later my phone lit up. One message. "Yeah, okay." Short, careful. The words of someone who had learned in the last few hours to keep their hopes small. I put the phone face down and sat with the weight of everything I had to do. What the morning asked of me. I did not go to Daniel's room that morning. This was not avoidance, though I understand it would have looked that way. This was preparation. I needed a few hours to become sure of what I was going to say, completely sure, certain in a way that left no room for the silence to swallow me again. I needed to know my own truth so well that it couldn't get lost on the way out of my mouth. I went for a run at 6 in the morning, a long one. Longer than usual, through the park and along the river and back through the quiet campus streets, where the only people awake were other runners and a few early shift workers and the birds, who had opinions about everything. I ran until my lungs ached pleasantly and my thoughts had stopped racing and settled into something calmer and clearer. I thought about Daniel. About who he was, not as a category, not as a complication, not as a thing I needed to figure out, but as a person. The specific, irreplaceable person who had knocked on my door with a soccer ball at 9 years old and changed the entire trajectory of my life. The person who remembered how I took my coffee and what my nightmares were usually about, and which songs made me feel like I could do anything. The person who had, apparently, been carrying love for me like a private weight for 6 months, and had found the courage to set it down even knowing it might cost him everything. I thought about what it had cost him to say those words, and I thought about what it would cost me to say mine. By the time I made it back to the dormitory, I was ready, or as close to ready as I was going to get. I showered. I put on real clothes rather than whatever I'd grabbed in the dark. I stood in front of my mirror for a moment and looked at myself and said, out loud, the thing I needed to say just to make sure it would come out. It came out. I walked down the hall and knocked on Daniel's door. 6 doors in a lifetime. He answered after a long moment. He was still in the clothes he'd been wearing the night before. He hadn't slept either, or if he had it had been briefly and badly. His hair was slightly disheveled, and he looked tired in a way that was painful to see, tired in the way of someone who has been sad and trying to manage it. He looked at me with an expression that was carefully neutral. He was protecting himself. I recognized it because I had seen him do it once or twice before in his life. The careful neutrality that means someone is bracing for something difficult. "Hey," he said. "Hey," I paused. "Can I come in?" He stepped back and let me in. His room was familiar to me as my own, the books stacked on every available surface, the photographs pinned above the desk, the specific organized chaos of a person who thinks clearly but lives messily. I had spent hundreds of hours in this room. I had sat in the worn blue chair by the window more times than I could count. I didn't sit now. I stood near the door and looked at him, and he stood near his desk and looked back at me, and the silence between us was different now. It was no longer comfortable. It had sharp edges. It was the silence of something unresolved. "I owe you an explanation," I said, "for last night." "You don't owe me anything," he said, quickly and quietly. "I put you in an impossible position and—" "Daniel," my voice came out firmer than I expected. He stopped. "Let me finish, please." He closed his mouth. He nodded once. I breathed. I thought about my run. I thought about standing in front of my mirror. I thought about 12 years of a person who deserved the truth. Last night when you said what you said, I went silent. And I know what that silence looked like. I know it looked like shock or discomfort or rejection. And I need you to know that it wasn't any of those things. I paused. It was the feeling of suddenly understanding something about yourself that you have been not understanding for a very long time. And I didn't have words for it yet because I was still in the middle of the understanding. His expression had shifted, slightly. The careful neutrality had softened just a degree, not into hope, not yet, but into something listening, something real. "I went home and I didn't sleep," I continued. "And I spent the whole night doing something I should have done years ago, which is actually looking at what I feel for you, not labeling it as friendship and filing it away, actually looking at it." I stopped. My heart was going fast. I could hear it. "Daniel, I've been in love with you for—" My voice wavered slightly. I steadied it. "For a very long time. I don't know exactly when it started because I think it started so gradually that there was no clear beginning. I just know that when you said what you said last night, the first thing I felt before anything else was warmth. And it took me all night to understand what that was." The room had gone very still. Daniel was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. I had seen every expression he had. I had cataloged them over 12 years. But this one was new, this particular combination of disbelief and relief, and something that might be called joy, but was too fragile and too overwhelmed to be called that yet. "Ethan," he said, his voice was different, rougher, like something had broken loose in it. "I know I have some things to figure out," I said, "about myself, About what this means for who I am and how I see myself, and I'm not pretending that's nothing. But those are things I can figure out. What I already know right now is how I feel about you, and I'm not standing in silence about it anymore. For a long moment he just looked at me, and I could see him processing it, cycling through the same disbelief and recalibration that I had experienced the night before, watching his understanding rearrange itself around a new truth. Then something broke open in his face. Not dramatically. Daniel wasn't dramatic in that way. It was quiet. It was the quiet opening of a door that had been closed for a long time. He crossed the room in 3 steps and he hugged me. Not the way he had hugged me 100 times before, the casual, easy contact of long friendship. This was something different. This was a person holding onto something they had been afraid to lose. His arms around me and his face against my shoulder, and his breathing unsteady in a way I had almost never heard from him before. I held him back, and I let myself feel it completely, without the layer of careful not-nomming I had always kept between us. I let it be what it was. "I thought you were going to tell me we were okay," he said into my shoulder, his voice muffled and slightly unsteady. "I've been preparing the speech where you tell me we're okay and you still want to be friends and nothing has to change." "Nothing has to change," I said. "Or everything does, I don't know, but it's not going back." He laughed at that, short and relieved and slightly wet at the edges. He pulled back enough to look at me, and his eyes were bright, and his expression was the most unguarded I had ever seen it, stripped of every layer of careful management. "You took 12 years," he said. "You took 6 months to tell me," I pointed out. "That's fair." We stood there and looked at each other, and something enormous and new existed in the space between us. It was still the same space. Still the same room, same worn blue chair, same organized chaos, same 12 years of history in every corner. But the air had changed. It was warmer. The slow, beautiful rearrangement. What followed was not a sudden transformation. Real things don't transform suddenly. They grow gradually in the direction of the light. We got coffee that morning at a place off campus, a small cafe with mismatched chairs and windows that looked out onto the street. We sat across from each other and we talked, really talked, the way we always had, except about things we had never before said out loud. Daniel told me about the slow, difficult journey of understanding his own feelings, the months of confusion in high school, the gradual acceptance in his first year of university, the terror and eventual relief of knowing who he was. He told me about falling in love with me specifically. When he thought it had begun, the moments he had almost said something, the many reasons he had talked himself out of it. I told him about my own long confusion, the years of misidentifying what I felt, the elaborate system I had built for not looking at things too directly, the strange overnight reconstruction that had left me sitting in the dark saying "oh" as if the word were a whole sentence. We talked for 3 hours. The cafe filled and emptied around us and we barely noticed. "Are you scared?" Daniel asked at one point. "Yes," I said honestly. "Are you?" "Terrified," he said. "But it's different now. Before, I was scared of something I couldn't control. Now I'm scared of something that's actually happening." "That's better," I said. "Much better," he agreed. We didn't rush anything. This was something we both understood without having to negotiate it. Whatever this was, whatever we were becoming to each other, it had been 12 years in the making, and there was no urgency about arriving anywhere in particular. There was just the matter of being present in what was actually there. We still went to the Thai place. We still argued about the iced tea recipe. We still stayed up too late watching things neither of us was fully watching and talking about everything and nothing. But there was more now, more honesty in the small moments, more willingness to let things be what they actually were rather than what we had decided to call them. There was the evening, 2 weeks later, when we were walking back from the library and Daniel reached for my hand and then stopped himself, the old reflex, and I took his hand first. He looked at me sideways and I looked straight ahead and he laughed very quietly. And we walked the rest of the way back holding hands in the soft May evening without making a particular production of it. There was the afternoon we sat in the campus garden and I told him out loud for the first time to anyone what I understood now about myself, about who I was. It came out in halting, inexact language because I was still learning the words, still learning how they fit in my mouth. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "How does it feel, saying it?" "Like putting down something heavy," I said. "Like I didn't know I was carrying it until I set it down." He nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that's about right." There were hard moments too. I would not tell this story without them, because the hard moments are part of the real one. There was a week in mid-May where I went quiet. Not on purpose. It was more like the size of the change caught up with me, the weight of understanding yourself differently after 21 years of a different understanding, and I needed space to sit inside it. Daniel gave me the space without making me justify needing it. He texted once, "Still here. No rush," and left it at that. And I loved him for it in a way that told me everything I needed to know about whether what I felt was real. There was a difficult conversation with myself about fear, about whether some of my hesitation came from genuine uncertainty, or whether it came from the specific cultural weight of a thing society had spent centuries making feel like a burden. I sat with that question for a long time. The answer, when I found it, was honest. Both. Some genuine uncertainty being processed at its own pace, and some fear that was not mine in origin, that had been handed to me by the world, and that I was choosing, deliberately, to put down. Choosing is the important word. I had a choice. I had always had a choice. I just hadn't been looking at it clearly enough to make it. The evening we named it. It was a Thursday evening in early June. Exam season was over. Summer was arriving in the slow way it does in this part of the country, warm and unhurried. We were on the roof of the dormitory, which was technically not permitted and practically done by everyone. Daniel had brought a blanket and I had brought snacks, and we lay on our backs in the last of the daylight and watched the sky go through its changes, the blue deepening toward something spectacular. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "You've been able to ask me anything for 12 years, he said. "Why would you start requiring permission now?" "Fair point." I looked at the sky. "What do you want this to be?" He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want it to be?" he asked. I asked first. A pause. "I want it to be what it already is," he said carefully, "which is everything we've always been, plus the things we're not pretending not to feel anymore." I thought about that. "I want that too," I said. "I also want—" I stopped. I started again. "I want to be with you, actually be with you, not figure it out as we go, not maybe someday, actually." Another pause. Longer this time. Then Daniel turned his head to look at me, and I turned mine to look at him, and we were very close in the way you are when you're lying next to someone on a shared blanket on a rooftop. "Okay," he said, quietly. The way he'd said "yeah, okay" in the text at 4 in the morning, but completely different, full instead of careful, open instead of braced. "Okay," I said. "Okay, I want that too." He was looking at me with the expression I had first seen in his room that morning after the confession, the unguarded one, the one I had filed away as new but had since realized was just what Daniel looked like when he wasn't protecting himself. Ethan. I have wanted that for longer than I knew what to call it. Above us, the sky had gone the deep orange rose of a summer evening in its final minutes of light. Below us, the campus moved with the slow ease of a Friday afternoon not yet turned to night. And between us, in the small, warm, honest space of a rooftop blanket, something that had been becoming for 12 years finally became. We stayed on that roof until the stars came out. We talked and we were quiet and we talked again. We made fun of each other and said sincere things and made plans for the summer and did not plan at all. We were exactly what we had always been, and something more, and neither of those things canceled out the other. At some point in the dark, Daniel said, "For the record, I knew something was wrong with you the moment you stopped saying absolutely idiotic things about that iced tea. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere uncomplicated. I'm standing by my position on the iced tea. The new recipe is objectively worse. The new recipe is objectively an improvement. This, he said, with great affection and exasperation, is going to be a recurring issue. I know, I said, I can't wait. What the silence held. It has been 8 months since the night on the amber-lit path. 8 months since Daniel said the words that rearranged everything, and I stood there in silence, and the silence turned out to hold much more than either of us knew. We are in our final year of university now. We still live 6 doors apart, which remains a running joke, though the nature of the joke has shifted considerably. We went home together for winter break and told our families, his first, then mine, and the telling was imperfect and complicated and easier than I had feared and harder than I had hoped, the way most true things are. His mother cried, but she also immediately began asking questions about my dietary restrictions because she had been planning to make a specific dish for dinner and wanted to make sure she had it right. My father was quiet for a long time and then said that he was glad I told him and that he was proud of me, and I went to my old childhood room and cried with relief for a while, which is one of the stranger and more necessary things I have ever done. We are building something, Daniel and I, something that has the architecture of 12 years of friendship underneath it. All that history, all those silences, all those moments of choosing each other before we understood completely why. We are building on top of it something new, something that is learning its own shape as it grows, and it is occasionally terrifying and regularly wonderful and absolutely, completely ours. I think about that moment on the path sometimes, the moment I stood there and found no words. I used to feel only shame about it. Now I think I understand it a little better. I think my silence was not emptiness. I think it was the sound of something enormous arriving that I didn't yet have the language for. The sound of a truth that had been waiting a very long time to be known. Daniel, for his part, has forgiven me for it completely. He has also, characteristically, refused to let me entirely off the hook. You know, he said once, a few months in, looking at me with that particular expression of his fond and a little merciless, most people, when someone they love confesses their feelings, manage to say something. Most people, I said, haven't been unknowingly in love with their best friend for a decade. That's a generous reading of your own response. I think I've earned some generosity. He smiled that smile, the one I had been looking at for 12 years and had only recently allowed myself to fully receive. Yeah, he said, you have. There is a specific kind of silence that only exists between two people who have known each other too long to pretend. I used to think I knew what it meant. I used to think it meant friendship deep, rare, the best kind. I know now that I was right. I just didn't know how much the word friendship could hold, how it could stretch to contain an entire life, an entire love, an entire person, how it could be the beginning of something rather than the name of its limit. Daniel is 6 doors away, probably surrounded by books and eating something questionable, probably about to text me some deeply unnecessary opinion about the iced tea situation, which has not been resolved and will likely never be resolved, and is, in some ways, the foundation of our relationship. And I am here, 21 years old and still learning the language of my own life, putting words to things I spent years not nomming, finding that the words, when they come, are warmer than the silence ever was. He knocked on my door at 9 years old with a soccer ball and an open question. And I have been saying yes ever since.
Hey guys, welcome to my YouTube channel Prism Heart Chronicles. Please subscribe to my channel for more videos.